My daughter-in-law pointed right at my face and said, "Pay rent or get out." I raised my son for 30 years, but it only took 3 seconds for my heart to shatter. I stood there frozen, not because of Emily's venomous words, but because Daniel, my son, was standing right behind her and lowering his head as if I were a stranger. The house I had poured so much money into fixing up had turned into a place where they were throwing me out like some freeloader. Emily looked at me with the eyes of a victor, eyes that made me understand she had never seen me as a mother, only as a walking wallet. And Daniel, he stayed silent, leaving me to carry that humiliation alone. But they forgot one thing. When a gentle mother is pushed to her limit, she stops being prey. That day, I didn't cry. I just smiled, a very dangerous smile. What do you think I should do to respond? Leave your opinion in the comments and subscribe to follow the next part where every unmasking is even more vicious than that one sentence. My name is Margaret Hale, 63 years old, dark-skinned in the way of American women who have spent a lifetime under sun and wind, used to standing tall through anything, even when there's no one left to lean on. I've been a widow for years. People say time softens wounds, but for me, there are empty spaces that grow louder with age, like a vacant room where every footstep echoes the same question. What do I have left? Now I have Daniel, my only son. I raised him with everything I had and everything I didn't. Since Daniel was a skinny little boy clinging to the hem of my shirt, I promised myself he would never have to go without love, would never have to live with the feeling of being abandoned. I kept that promise. I worked, saved, counted every dollar, then smiled as if everything was fine, because as long as Daniel was safe, I could endure anything. Then Daniel grew up, and his family gained one more person, Emily Clark. Emily is beautiful in a way that makes people look twice. She has a bright smile, eyes that know how to soften at the right time, a polished voice that always sounds polite. But I have lived long enough to understand the more perfect someone looks on the outside, the colder they can be inside. Emily was like that. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to do anything crude. A glance, a pause, manners placed in the wrong place, that was enough to make the person across from her shrink without even knowing why. Daniel is gentle. That gentleness used to be what made me proud. But ever since he married Emily, that gentleness turned into weakness before I even realized it. He kept telling me Emily was just blunt, that she's under a lot of pressure, that "Mom, don't take it to heart." Those phrases were like a thin curtain covering something I couldn't name until the day it was ripped wide open. I spent my whole life fighting loss, only to be handed another stab. That day, I stood in my own kitchen, the oven breathing warmth, the smell of butter and sugar mixing with the toasted pecans. I made this cake because Daniel loved it. When he was little, every time I baked pecan pie, he would stand beside the counter, sneak a few crisp crumbs, then grin, his eyes lighting up as if the world only held simple joys like that. I set the cake into a box, tied the string neatly. On the drive to Daniel's house, I watched bare trees slide past the car window. The sky was gray, the wind sharp, the kind of day that makes you want to stay inside, wrap your hands around a hot cup of tea. I kept thinking, if I just visit, if I just bring a little sweetness to my son's home, everything will soften. I'll sit down, listen to Daniel talk, see Emily relax a little, and when I leave, I'll feel like I still belong somewhere. The house came into view, tidy, new, bright, the kind of place I had poured a lot of money into repairing and upgrading. I climbed the steps, holding the box of cake, telling myself not to be sensitive, not to imagine things. I rang the bell. The door opened. Emily stood there, not hurried, not greeting me right away. She looked from the cake box to my face, then lingered longer as if weighing merchandise. Her gaze was sharp as a blade, not the obvious kind, but the kind sharpened by habit, by control. "I brought pecan cake for Daniel," I said, trying to keep my voice warm. "I thought the two of you could eat it together." Emily curled her lip, smiling faintly, a smile that never reached her eyes. She opened the door wider by just a little, enough for me to step in, but there was no welcome in it. I crossed the threshold and immediately felt the air inside was colder than outside, not because of temperature, but because of Emily's presence, because of the way she stood like a wall. Daniel was at the end of the hallway near the living room. He looked at me, then looked at Emily. I waited for a "Mom, you're here," waited for footsteps rushing toward me like in the old days. But Daniel just stood there, his shoulders slightly drawn in, his face uncertain, like someone waiting for permission. Emily turned to me, her voice calm, as if she were announcing something settled long ago. "You need to pay rent," she said, each word dropping onto the tile like ice. "Or get out of here." I thought I misheard. For a second, every sound seemed to vanish, leaving only the thud of my blood in my ears. My hands tightened around the cake box until the string bit into my skin. I stared straight at Emily. Her face didn't move. No hesitation, no doubt, only the certainty of someone passing sentence. I turned to Daniel. He lowered his head. In that moment, I felt like I wasn't standing in this house anymore. It was as if I stood in an empty field where all the years I had sacrificed were blown away by the wind, and the one person I had poured my heart into chose silence. Emily didn't hurt me the most. Daniel did. His silence, his bowed head, as if admitting I was unwanted in the very place I had helped build. There was no tremor of defense, no instinct to stand between me and humiliation, only surrender. I heard my own voice, thin and hoarse, like someone whose breath had been taken. "Daniel, I called. Did you hear what she just said?" He swallowed hard. His lips parted, like he might speak, then stopped. His eyes avoided mine, like a child afraid of punishment. But I had never punished him for anything. I had believed I did enough to raise him into a man who would stand up for what's right, who would at least give his mother the basic respect she deserved. And now he stood behind his wife, letting one cruel sentence cut the last thread tying me to the word family. Emily stepped half a pace closer, as if reminding me she held the power. Her perfume drifted over, sweet and sharp, clinging to the air like a claim of territory. I looked down at the cake box in my hands, something I brought in hope, and suddenly it felt heavy with my own foolishness. I didn't cry. Tears couldn't reach that collapse fast enough. I just stood there, staring at the two of them, the cold daughter-in-law and the silent son, and I understood something that made my spine go ice cold. I walked into their house with love, and I was being pushed out of my son's life like an object that no longer had value. And I still didn't know that sentence was only the first door opening onto a depth I had never imagined. I stepped out of Daniel's house with the pecan cake box still in my hands, the string biting red into my skin like a reminder. I got into my car, closed the door, and when the click of its sealing shut echoed, my heart finally started beating normally again. On the windshield, my reflection blurred, the face of an old mother who had just been crossed off the place she once thought was home. I didn't drive back right away. I parked at the end of the street, staring at that house from a distance, like looking at something that used to be mine, but had been stolen by a single sentence. Daniel was still behind that door in my head. The way he lowered his face kept replaying. I felt anger, then sadness, then a chill crawling up my spine, because I understood Emily wouldn't stop at humiliating me. I went home in silence. That night, I sat at my dining table and set the cake box down as if I were placing a memory that had been trampled. When I became a widow, I thought I had already taken the biggest pain of my life. But being turned on by my own son was something else. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. It gnawed. It made you doubt every choice you ever made. The next morning, I opened my spending notebook, the thing I'd kept out of habit for years. The numbers stared back, clear as a confession. I had paid for so many things for them, small amounts, that turned into big ones. Money to fix the roof, money to replace the heating system, money for furniture, and even the monthly support Emily always called temporary. I used to tell myself it was an investment in Daniel's happiness, but now it looked like feeding a hungry mouth that would never learn the meaning of enough. I picked up my phone and looked at Daniel's name, my finger trembling slightly. Then I hit call. When he answered, his voice sounded tired, like he was living in a room with no oxygen. I spoke straight because I knew if I softened, Emily would win. "Daniel, I'm coming over. I need to talk." When I arrived, Emily opened the door, still that same look, but today it carried a sharper edge of caution. I didn't bring cake. I didn't bring gifts. I brought only one thing: clarity. Daniel stood in the living room, hands in his pockets, his back slightly hunched, like a man who had already lost a fight and didn't know how. I looked straight at both of them, and the words came out of my mouth cold as metal. "From today on, I will not pay one more dollar for this house." The air changed instantly. Emily blinked faster, her lips pressed tight. Then she pulled up a quick fake smile, like a mask yanked on in a hurry. She let out a short laugh, then her voice trembled, trying to hide it under contempt. "Who do you think you are, an old freeloader?" I felt that sentence like a slap, but I didn't step back. I have lived long enough to know people who love insulting others are often terrified of someone standing upright. I replied each word slow and steady. "I am the one who helped you have this house, and I am also the one with the right to stop." Daniel took one step forward, but not to protect me. He stammered, eyes fixed on the floor. "Mom, don't make this worse. Emily, just got heated. Mom, go home and we'll talk later." I turned to him and saw something in his eyes, exhaustion mixed with fear, like he was trying to mediate a war he didn't have the spine to choose a side in. I asked, my voice not loud, but sharp enough to cut through his excuses, "You want me to keep paying in exchange for being thrown out of your house, Daniel?" He froze like I had blocked his breath. Emily immediately cut in, her voice higher, faster. "You're manipulating him. You always think you're the center. Daniel needs his own life. Do you understand?" I looked at Emily and saw it more clearly than ever. Under the powder and the smile was panic. Panic over losing money. Panic because the walking wallet wouldn't open anymore. The more she talked, the more her face slipped off that polite mask, revealing raw, naked cruelty. I left after that. Not because I lost, but because I had said what needed to be said, and staying would only give Emily more chances to twist the knife. On the drive home, my hands felt cold, but inside something brightened, like I had finally opened a vent in a suffocating room. The consequences hit faster than I expected. 2 days later, my phone kept buzzing notifications from the bank, from the old account I used to transfer money to Daniel. I didn't send anything, and my silence was like pulling a stake from a tent. Everything began to wobble. Daniel started calling me more than ever, but every call began with the same awkwardness. "Mom, we have a bit of a problem." Then the bill started piling up. I heard Daniel talk about late payments, penalty fees, credit cards brushing their limits. His voice grew smaller, thinner, like he was being dragged between two tightening ropes. I asked one simple question: does Emily work? Daniel stayed quiet for a long moment, then finally said, "She's looking for a better opportunity." I knew what that meant. I'd heard it once, then again, and every time the better opportunity hadn't arrived. My money still filled the gap. Emily didn't call me, but I could feel her talking about me somewhere, in words harsher than the ones she used to my face. Daniel began avoiding me, avoiding my eyes, like distance between mother and son was the easiest thing to build when a third person stood in the middle. A week passed, and I ran into Daniel in the grocery store parking lot. He looks like he wanted to rush over and hug me, but then he stopped, eyes flipping around like he was afraid someone would see. I asked, "Are you okay?" He said, "I'm okay," but the words were hollow, and I could see he was getting thinner. That night, I sat alone in my living room, lights off, letting only the glow of my phone spill over my hands. I thought about Thomas Hale, my husband, the man who once told me that if your child ever loses their way, you have to be strong enough to pull them back, even if it hurts. I wondered if I was pulling Daniel back or pushing him farther away. The phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. No name, no picture, just one short line that felt colder than the wind outside my window. "If you still love your son, don't stay silent." That strange message from that night still sat on my screen like a pin stuck into my mind. The next morning, I still got up on time, brewed coffee, opened the curtains, did the familiar things to keep myself steady. I told myself it could have been nothing more than someone trying to scare me or a wrong number. But the uneasiness stayed clinging to me like someone was standing right behind my back and I couldn't turn around. By noon, I heard a car stop in front of my house. A delivery worker handed me a thick envelope, stiff paper, the bank's logo printed in the top left corner. I signed for it, my hand trembling a little because I had grown too used to letters connected to Daniel, carrying a request, a favor, a problem that needed money. I carried the envelope to the table, stared at it for a few seconds, then tore it open. Inside was a debt notice. The number 42,000 USD sat in the middle line, heavy and cold like a sentence. I read it 3 times, hoping I had misread the punctuation, misread the digits, misread the name. But no, the borrower's name was printed clearly, Margaret Hale. My home address, the related account number, the payment schedule. At the bottom of the page was a signature. That signature looked exactly like mine. I sat down in the chair feeling like a stone had dropped into my chest. I know my own signature, every curve, every stroke, the habit of dragging the last letter a little longer. It was there, complete convincing, as if I had put pen to paper myself. But I had never signed. I had never opened any loan. I live frugally. Even replacing a washing machine makes me hesitate for a month. How could I borrow 42,000 USD and not remember? I flipped the page, read the details. There was a signing date, a location, a staff member in charge. Everything looked legitimate in a way that was terrifying. I heard the wall clock ticking, each beat tapping at my temples. I called the bank hotline, trying to keep my voice normal, but the question came out urgent. I want to verify a loan under the name Margaret Hale. I did not make this transaction. The employee asked for information, checked, then said in a voice that was polite to the point of cruelty, "The record shows you signed in person. The signature matches. The documents are complete. The loan has been disbursed." I asked where the money had been sent. They said they could only provide it after I filed an official dispute along with identity verification and their internal investigation process. I set the phone down and stared at my hands as if my own hands had betrayed me. In my mind, one face appeared, Emily, and right after that, Daniel standing silent behind her. I didn't hesitate long. I wanted to hear them answer to my face. I drove to Daniel's house, the envelope tucked under my arm like evidence. On the way, I pictured a dozen scenarios. Emily tricked me with some document. Emily used my name to sign up for something. Emily used my social security number. Each scenario tightened my stomach. Emily opened the door, still calm, the way she always was, as if the one who had just read a 42,000 USD sentence wasn't me. Daniel stood behind her, eyes exhausted, the dark circles deeper than the last time. I walked straight into the living room, laid the paper on the table, slid it toward them. "Explain," I said, my voice rough. "I just received a debt notice for 42,000 USD in my name." Daniel bent down to read, his eyes widening. Emily glanced once, then curled her lip into a smirk. She didn't flinch, didn't show even a flicker of worry, and that chilled me. She leaned back in the chair, crossed her legs, like someone who already had an answer ready. "You're old. Your memory's bad," Emily said, light as air, but sharp. "You signed it and forgot. Nobody will believe you." I felt heat rush to my face, but I held myself because I knew if I blew up, she would turn me into the unstable one. I leaned down, pointed at the signature. "So you want to say I signed this and I just don't remember, right? Emily, do you think I'm that stupid?" Emily tilted her head, smiling like she pitied me. "Who do you think you are? Who are you going to sue? The bank has a signature, has paperwork, has a file. What do you have besides your mouth?" Daniel looked up at me, then at Emily. I waited for him to say something, even one sentence, like, "Emily, what are you talking about?" or "Mom, let me check." But he just stood there, stretched tight from both sides. Daniel's silence this time was heavier than the last because it was happening in the face of a crime. I turned to my son, trying to keep my voice softer, but it still hurt like someone was pulling my heart out. "Daniel, do you believe your mother or do you believe her?" I saw Daniel's hands tremble slightly. He drew in a breath, his lips moving, then his voice cracked like glass. I don't know." That answer burned my eyes. "I don't know" is what people say when they're afraid to choose, when they know one choice will wreck their life, and they would rather put their own mother on the scale with a woman who is smirking than face the truth. I looked at Daniel, the child I used to hold in my arms, the one I stayed up all night for when he had a fever, the one I sold my days off to buy a decent suit for his interviews. And now, right in front of me, he had become a man about to hand the key to his life to the very person who would destroy it while he still called it love. I gathered the paper, slid it back into the envelope, my hands no longer shaking. I looked at Emily, so cold even I surprised myself. "If you think I will bow my head because of a forged signature, you are wrong." Emily laughed, dry and high. "What are you going to do to me? You're just an old, difficult woman. Daniel will choose me." Daniel didn't object. He also didn't look me in the eye. He stood there, and his confusion was like a blade slowly cutting the last thread between mother and son. I turned and walked to the door, hearing Emily toss a line behind me like trash. "Stop acting. You won't get anywhere." I got home when the sky was dim. I set the envelope on the table and stared at it like a dangerous animal sleeping. Inside me was a new fear, not fear of debt, but fear that Emily had gotten deeper than I thought, so deep she could write my signature, so deep she could drag Daniel down and he would still call it love. My phone buzzed, that same unknown number again. The text was short, blunt, ice cold, like someone watching me from very close. The debt file is only the beginning. Meet me. The message, meet me, kept me from sleeping. I set my phone down, then picked it up again, staring at those words like a door opening into danger. I have lived long enough to know the sender could be the one who saves you or the one who pushes you deeper. But if Emily truly forged my signature, then I was standing alone in front of a filthy weapon, and I needed any clue I could get. The next morning, I called the bank to ask about the dispute procedure. They told me I had to file a claim, provide identity verification, and wait for an investigation. The voice on the line was polite, but the time I would have to wait was vague, and the debt still hung over my head like a blade. I understood if I just sat and waited, Emily would have time to erase the traces, and Daniel would have time to fall into the next trap. I spread my papers across the table, went back through the transfer receipts to Daniel, the home repair bills, the old emails. The more I looked, the clearer one frightening truth became. I had given them more than money. I had handed over control in paperwork, in habits, in trust. And Emily needed only a small crack to turn that trust into a rope. The doorbell rang at noon, firm, short. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first feeling was cold, like my instinct warning me everything was about to change direction. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole. A man stood straight, wearing a dark coat, his face serious, his eyes measuring the distance between me and a major decision. I opened the door, but kept my hand on the latch, the habit of a woman who has lived alone too long. He looked at me, nodded slightly, then said my name as if he already knew it, Mrs. Margaret Hale. "Who are you?" I asked, "and what do you want with me?" He handed me a business card. The name was clear, Jonathan Reeves, fraud investigation attorney. I read it twice, still not relaxing. He continued, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that pressed straight into my chest. "I came for you, and for your son." That made me pause. Daniel, that name always took away my advantage. I opened the door wider and let him in, but my eyes still tracked every movement. Jonathan sat in the chair across from me, placed a briefcase on the table, unlatched it like a man preparing to present a case, not have a conversation. "I know you received the debt notice," he said, "and I know you suspected the right person." I swallowed. "You know Emily?" Jonathan nodded, pulled out a thick file. He didn't rush to hand it over, as if he wanted me to brace myself. Then he slid the first page toward me, Emily Clark's name, along with timelines, addresses, and another name I had never heard before, Andrew Clark. Her ex-husband Jonathan said, and his story is exactly Daniel's story. The only difference is he lost before he had time to understand he was being scammed. I felt the back of my neck tighten. I turned the page, my eyes reading while my hands grew colder. A complaint, bank reports, loans taken under other people's names, matching signatures, transfers into unknown accounts. Each line was like a cut because it made me understand Emily wasn't the type to blurt cruel words in a moment of anger. She was a predator, and my family was simply the next prey. Jonathan watched me like he was watching the exact point where I might break. Then he said it plainly. Emily is not a victim. She builds a script. She chooses targets. She makes a man believe she is his whole world. Then she uses that trust to open every door. I remembered Emily's eyes when she said, "Nobody will believe you." I remembered Daniel stammering, "I don't know." Now, those pieces snapped together into a picture so clear it was brutal. I wanted to deny it because denial would be easier to breathe with, but truth has its own smell, a cold, dry, metallic scent, and I could smell it right there on my table. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked. You're an attorney. You can work with the police. Jonathan leaned back, his voice lowering. I'm working in that direction. But you are the only one who can stop the next strike because you're the one Emily hasn't managed to remove from the game yet. I stared at him. What is the next strike? Jonathan didn't answer right away. He pulled out another sheet. On it was a bank appointment schedule, a note about a new loan, Daniel's name written in the signer section. My chest tightened because I understood Emily was shifting from my money to Daniel's, and once Daniel signed, everything would collapse like a hollow wall. If you don't stop her, Jonathan said, each word dropping like stones into a well, Daniel will lose everything, money, the house, and his future. I gripped the table edge. What do I have to do? Jonathan opened the briefcase again. This time, he didn't take out paperwork. He took out a printed color photograph and placed it face down on the table. He looked at me, eyes so serious, I felt like I was about to hear an explosion. Then he flipped the photo over and threw it down in front of me. It was Emily, holding and kissing a strange man. The photo Jonathan Reeves threw onto the table dried my throat. Emily was holding and kissing a strange man, her face soft and intimate in a way I had never seen when she stood beside Daniel. I stared for a long time, then looked up. What do you want me to do with this? Jonathan said, his voice firm. You need to get there before Daniel signs a new document, and you have to make him stop. The evidence and the legal process I'll handle, but only if we get Daniel out of the trap in time. I asked for the location, the time. Jonathan handed me a scrap of paper with the bank appointment written on it, a meeting that had already been set up. My hands went cold because I understood Emily was one step ahead, and this step was aimed straight at my son's future. I grabbed my phone and called Daniel right away, but he didn't pick up. I texted, "Listen to me, just once. Don't sign anything." The message showed sent, then silence. Jonathan watched me, his eyes weighing speed and risk. You won't convince Daniel with anger, he said. Emily has trained him to react to your voice as if it's control. You need to say the right thing at the right moment, and you have to be there before the pen touches the paper. I nodded, even though my insides were chaos. Part of me wanted to run straight to Daniel's house, throw the door open, drag him away. Another part feared my presence would give Emily more material to play the victim. But I had no other choice, because if Daniel signed, everything would clamp shut like an iron trap. We got close to the bank in the afternoon. Jonathan didn't walk in with me right away. He said he would watch from a good position to keep Emily from getting suspicious. I went in alone, my palms slick with sweat. Through the front glass, I saw Daniel and Emily in the waiting area like a normal couple, handling paperwork, speaking softly, and every so often Emily leaned close to Daniel's ear as if whispering a sweet secret. I stood a few steps away and heard Emily clearly, her voice velvet smooth. Just sign it and we'll start a better new life. No one will interfere anymore. She said it like she was talking about a trip, a new home, a bright future. But I could see Daniel nodding slowly, like a man being hypnotized by a vision of escape from pressures Emily herself had built. Daniel looked down at the stack of papers, a pen in his hand. I saw his wrist tremble a little, but Emily immediately put her hand on his shoulder, a touch that was just enough to soothe, just enough to control. I walked fast toward them, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid the whole room would hear it. Daniel, I called, my voice cutting through the hum of printers and murmured conversation. Daniel turned, surprise flashing across his face, then tightening into tension. Emily turned too, the smile on her mouth switching off like a light. I stared straight at my son, at the pen in his hand, and my voice came out rough and urgent. "Daniel, you're signing your life sentence." Daniel's whole body went rigid. He looked at me like I had just shattered something fragile he was clinging to. Emily leaned toward Daniel first like a shield, like she was shaping the story in that very second. She snapped, "What are you doing here? Are you stalking us?" I ignored Emily and looked only at Daniel. "I have proof Emily is scamming you. She forged my signature. Now she wants you to carry this so she can disappear." Daniel's face reddened, his hand tightening around the pen. He shot up the chair, scraping hard against the floor. Then he yelled, his voice cracking with anger and shame, "You have no right to control my life." That slammed into me like a door. I understood why he said it. Emily had planted the idea that every warning from me was interference. I tried to keep my voice steadier. "I'm not controlling you. I'm saving you, Daniel." Emily gave a small laugh, but her eyes darkened. She moved close to Daniel, her arms sliding around his waist like a claim. Then she switched her tone instantly, her voice breaking into sobs, acting so smooth that even strangers could believe it. She hugged Daniel and pressed her face to his chest. She hated me from the first day because I took her son away from her. Daniel flinched. I saw his shoulders sink like he had just heard the exact sentence that made him soften. He looked at Emily, then at me, his eyes wavering, then tipping toward her like a string was pulling him. I wanted to say more to pull him back with every year I had lived for him, but Emily had pinned my words under the label hatred, and that label made Daniel unable to hear the truth. The bank employee walked over politely and asked if they were ready to sign. Emily wiped her tears, sighed, and nodded like a strong wife forced to endure a cruel mother-in-law. Daniel sat back down, his face tight, lips pressed, like he was proving something to me, to Emily, and to himself. I stepped one step closer. "Daniel, look at me, please. Look at me." Daniel avoided my eyes. His hand lowered the pen to the page, the tip hovering near the signature line, and I felt that moment stretch out like a verdict being delivered. Daniel put the pen on the paper. The tip of Daniel's pen touched the paper, and in that moment, I felt my heart slip a beat. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out on instinct, wanting to snatch the pen, wanting to pull my son away from the signing table that was turning into an execution table. Emily glanced at me, her eyes cold and warning, as if the second I touched anything, she would turn me into the troublemaker in front of everyone. Daniel lowered his head, focused on the signature line, his lips pressed tight. I could see the veins on his hand rising, as if he knew he was doing the wrong thing, but was forcing himself to finish. Emily stood close behind him, her hand on his shoulder like an anchor, like a soft chain. I heard the bank employee murmur, "Just sign here and you're done," and those words made me choke. I called my son's name again, Daniel, but my voice was swallowed by the thick, tense air. Daniel didn't look up. The pen began to move, the first stroke of ink stretching across the page, thin and black like a crack forming where it could never be sealed again. Right then, the door behind us flew open. The sound snapped through the branch, and a few people flinched and turned. Jonathan Reeves walked in like a cold gust, his face hard as stone. He didn't stop to explain to anyone. He moved straight toward the signing table, and his voice exploded across the lobby. "Stop! This contract is fraud!" Daniel jerked his hand back, the pen skidding a streak of ink dragging across the line like a mark of collapse. Emily whipped around, eyes wide, then instantly sharpened into fury like someone had invaded her territory. The bank employee froze, staring at Jonathan like he had brought danger with him. Jonathan planted his hand on the table and pulled the stack of papers toward himself, forcing Daniel to lift the pen away. He drew a bundle of documents from his case and threw them onto the table one by one, decisive and exact. Mrs. Margaret Hale's signature was forged, he said, then looked straight at the bank employee. And here is evidence that this new loan was built to transfer liability onto Daniel Hale. Daniel shot to his feet, eyes frantic. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" I looked at my son and saw his eyes turning red like a man shoved awake from a dream. I wanted to hold him, but I knew Emily would use my emotion as a weapon, so I steadied my voice. "Listen to him, Daniel." Emily stepped forward, her voice high and sharp. "I don't know who you are. Don't slander me." But as she spoke, I saw her throat tense and her hand clamp so hard it turned white. That wasn't the reaction of an innocent woman. That was the reaction of someone whose hidden blade had been touched. Jonathan didn't argue in circles. He opened another file and pushed a copy of transfer statements toward Daniel. Lines of money, highlighted dates, receiving accounts, a strange name. He pointed at it. "This is the money Emily has been sending out for months, small amounts to avoid attention. And this is the travel schedule, tickets, hotel bookings, a new life in another state." Daniel stared down, his lips trembling. This can't be." He looked up at Emily like he was waiting for her to laugh and say it was all a misunderstanding. But Emily couldn't laugh. Her eyes darted fast like she was searching for an exit. I watched Daniel and felt my mother's heart split in two, one half wanting to shield him, the other half wanting to shake him awake with the truth. Jonathan kept going, his voice cold. "And here is the photo, Emily, with another man, the man she is preparing to run away with right after Daniel signs." Daniel looked like he'd been punched in the chest. He stumbled back a step and hit the chair. His whole body shook. Then he rasped, small and rough, "Emily, tell them it's not true." Emily looked at Daniel, and for a flicker there was something like rage that the plan had been broken. Then she turned to me, and every mask fell away. Her voice flew out like thrown knives. "You filthy old woman, useless, you ruined everything." The entire bank lobby went dead silent. I heard someone draw in a sharp breath. The bank employee backed away, a hand lifting like they were about to call security. Daniel stood frozen, like he was finally seeing how far he had been led by sweet whispers. Emily pointed straight at me, her face burning red. "If it weren't for you, I would have finished." She snapped her gaze at Jonathan, eyes blazing. "Who do you think you are?" Then she looked back at Daniel, her tone shifting fast, soft, and dangerous at the same time. "You believe them? You believe your mother more than your wife." Daniel didn't answer. He stared at the smeared ink line on the paper like he was staring at a border between his old life and the life about to collapse. I stepped closer to my son and said quietly, "You don't have to sign any more. Come home with me." Right then, pounding hit the door hard, repeated like a hammer beating into the chaos inside the room. Everyone turned toward the entrance. A man's voice roared, full of fury and desperation. "Emily, you think you can run?" The bank door shuddered once more, then swung open. The man who had just shouted Emily's name walked in like a fire that had been compressed for too long. He was tall, broad-shouldered, hollow-faced, his eyes red with rage and exhaustion. He scanned the room, swept past me, past Jonathan Reeves, past Daniel, then stopped on Emily, as if years of betrayal were collapsing into a single point. Emily froze. For a very brief beat, I saw her lose control, like someone who had just met the ghost she thought she buried. Then she snapped back into that familiar shamelessness, her mouth twisting into a smirk, her eyes sharpening, as if she were about to lunge into a fight. But this time, the air had changed because it wasn't only me facing her anymore. The man took a few steps forward, his voice rough. "Emily, you thought you could hide forever." He pulled a rumpled stack of papers from his coat pocket and tossed it onto the nearest counter. "My name is Andrew Clark," he said, then looked straight at Daniel. "I used to be her husband." Daniel stood rigid, eyes wide. I heard my son's breathing speed up like every vein had just been yanked tight. Jonathan glanced at Andrew and nodded as if confirming the last piece had arrived at exactly the right moment. Andrew turned back to Emily, his voice bitter. "You forged documents the same way you're doing to them." He pointed toward the signing table. "The signatures, the loans, the paperwork that looks legitimate, it's all a trap." He paused for a beat, then continued. "You made me sign. You made me believe it was for family. Then I ended up drowning in debt. When I found out, you disappeared, clean, as if you had never existed." Emily let out a sharp, mocking laugh, the sound slicing through the room. "You've got the nerve to talk, Andrew," she said, her tone dripping with ridicule. "You were stupid, so you pay for it." But her hand trembled and her eyes flicked toward the door, measuring escape. I saw the fear in it because Andrew wasn't someone she could scare off with a few tears. Andrew stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I've been looking for you all this time." "I thought I was the only one you drained dry until I heard about a Margaret Hale trapped in debt with a forged signature." He turned to me, his eyes softening for a moment. "I'm sorry you got pulled into this. She does it like it's habit." Daniel looked from me to Emily like he was seeing the real face behind the shell for the first time. Emily realized Daniel was wavering, and she shifted targets instantly. She snapped toward me, pointing straight at my face, her scream breaking loose. "If it weren't for you, I would have gotten away. You'll pay for this." Daniel flinched hard. I saw something shatter in his eyes, no longer confusion, but a painful, complete awakening. He stared at Emily, his lips trembling. Then his voice fell low like a late confession. "You never loved anyone, did you?" Emily stood still. No denial, no performance, no tears. Her silence was so bare it cooled the whole room. Daniel held her gaze for one more second, then his knees gave out like a man whose strength had been drained. I rushed to him, my hands catching his shoulders, feeling my son's bones shaking under his shirt. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice steady. "Emily Clark, you are under investigation for financial fraud and forged documents." Andrew stood beside him, eyes locked on Emily like he was afraid she would vanish again. Emily took half a step back, eyes darting, mouth tightening, then suddenly turned as if she were about to bolt for the door. Right then, heavy, decisive footsteps struck the floor behind her. A uniformed figure appeared directly at Emily's back. The police had arrived. The police officer appearing behind Emily made her whole body jolt. I saw a flicker of panic flash through her eyes, then it was quickly replaced by her familiar arrogance, as if she still believed she could twist everything with her tongue. The officer stepped forward, voice decisive, ordering Emily to turn around and put her hands out. Emily let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "What right do you have?" she said, then glanced at Daniel as if searching for a shield. But Daniel was no longer a shield. He stood there, eyes red, face pale, his body as if all strength had been drained from it. His silence this time wasn't weakness, it was collapse. Jonathan Reeves stepped in, presented the file, and spoke quickly in the way of a man used to dealing with dirty things. He laid out the forged signature, the transfer statements, the escape itinerary, and Andrew Clark's account. The officer reviewed it, then signaled for a colleague to come in and assist. The air in the bank lobby turned so heavy, I could hear the handcuffs click as they were pulled out. Emily yanked her hands back, fighting like an animal cornered. She screamed, cursed, tried to drag the attention toward me as if I were the source of every disaster. But this time, her screaming didn't work. It rang hollow because the truth was standing in a line right in front of everyone. The officer read the charges in an even, cold voice, each word stamping down. Federal fraud, document forgery, theft of assets, credit fraud. I listened as if I were hearing the list of what Emily had planted into my life, into Daniel's life, and now it was turning back into the price she would pay. Emily laughed like she'd gone mad, her eyes blazing. I will come back. When the cuffs locked around her wrists, Emily still held her chin high. She turned to look at Daniel, her stare full of challenge, as if trying to hook into him one last time. But Daniel didn't look back. He stared at the floor, at the smeared ink on the paperwork, and I could see my son's past and future falling like ash. Emily was led out through the lobby. Andrew stood still, both hands clenched, his face held so tight it trembled. Jonathan spoke briefly with the police about the next steps, about preserving evidence, about contacting the bank to freeze the file. I caught words like investigation, file, federal, and each one made me realize this had gone far beyond a family argument. The glass door shut behind Emily, and in that exact moment, Daniel crumpled. I rushed forward and caught him before he fully fell. His body was heavy as stone, shaking like a child coming out of a long nightmare. He clutched my sleeve, his grip painful. Then a sob burst out like a wound splitting open. "I was so blind, Mom," Daniel said, his voice breaking apart. I heard that and felt my heart squeezed shut. Pain, love, anger, then all of it dissolving into exhaustion. I rubbed his back, the motions so familiar, like when he was small, the nights he burned with fever, when I carried him through a dark house and whispered that his mother was here. I bent close to Daniel's ear and spoke slowly, like I was placing a rope in his hands so he could hold on and live. Bad people have to pay. I'm here. I never left you. Daniel gasped, tears soaking my shirt. I didn't care how the people around us looked. The only thing I needed was my son still breathing, still here, still having a chance to start over. I looked up and met Jonathan's eyes. He stood a few steps away, his expression not like a man who had won, but like a man who had just remembered something bigger, heavier. He came closer, lowered his voice, and looked straight at me as if he were warning me of another shock. "You need to know one more thing." Jonathan Reeves stood in front of me, and his eyes were no longer sharp and cold the way they were when he handled paperwork. They had lowered like a man choosing each word so he wouldn't break someone further. Daniel was still leaning against me, his breathing heavy and uneven like he had just escaped a deep pit. I brushed my son's hair back, then looked at Jonathan. "You said I need to know one more thing. What is it?" Jonathan stayed quiet for a beat, as if to make sure Daniel wouldn't hear too much while he was falling apart. Then he spoke softly. "Can we step outside for a few minutes, Mrs. Margaret?" I hesitated, then nodded. Andrew Clark was nearby, watching like a guard, and the bank staff were talking with the police. I steadied Daniel into a safer position, told him to stay, then followed Jonathan out into the small hallway beyond the lobby. I hadn't even asked again when Jonathan pulled an old wallet from his coat pocket and opened it to a small photo with worn edges. I looked at it and my chest tightened. Thomas Hale, my husband. That gentle smile and familiar gaze yanked me back to the years when I still had a shoulder to lean on, when I still had a man who called me honey and treated me like home. I looked up, my voice unsteady. "Why do you have a photo of my husband?" Jonathan drew in a deep breath, then said it like a confession. "Your husband saved me from a wrongful sentence 20 years ago." I froze. 20 years is long enough for people to forget many things, but also close enough for a real debt of gratitude to stay intact. I remember Thomas once spending a period running around helping a man I had never met, coming home late, eyes red from lack of sleep, yet speaking to me in a firm voice. "Someone is being framed. I can't turn my back." Jonathan said that back then he was still young, pulled into a case that pinned guilt on him, a file that was nearly closed, and all it would have taken was one confirming signature to stamp his life forever. Thomas Hale had refused that easy ending. He found witnesses, dug up evidence, matched timelines, and forced the truth into the light, even when everyone told him it was pointless. Jonathan said that during those nights, Thomas stayed up until morning, his hands stained with ink and paper dust, still patient as if he were defending family. My throat tightened as I listened. I had known Thomas was a good man, but I had never known his goodness had traveled that far. In my mind, I saw him standing at the door, taking off his coat, rain clinging to his shoulders, then smiling at me like it was nothing. I had lived so many years with a man like that, and I had never realized he had saved a life outside our own. Jonathan looked at me, gratitude from years ago shining in his eyes. I owed him more than I could ever repay. When he passed away, I came to the funeral. You may not remember me because I stood very far away. I truly didn't remember that day. I was like a walking corpse who came, who left. Everything drifted by like fog. But Jonathan's words made me feel Thomas was still connected to this world by threads I had never seen. Jonathan went on, his voice slower. "Before he died, he said, 'If my wife ever gets in trouble, protect her for me.'" I heard that and my eyes burned instantly, like someone had touched a wound that never fully closed. I tried to speak, but no sound came out, because if I opened my mouth, I feared I would break. I looked down at the photo in Jonathan's hand, at Thomas's smile, and everything I had been holding back since Emily humiliated me, since I saw that forged signature, since I heard Daniel say, "I don't know," surged out like a dam bursting. I started crying, the sobs tight and deep, like a woman finally allowed to be weak after too many days of standing rigid. I whispered like I was speaking to myself, like I was speaking to Thomas somewhere right in front of me but unseen. He's still protecting me, even when he's not here. Jonathan didn't say anything else. He only nodded slightly, letting me cry long enough to breathe again. I wiped my face and started to turn back toward Daniel when a bank staff member came over and handed me a thin envelope. The person said, "Someone asked us to pass this to you. They didn't leave a name." I took the envelope and felt a cold line run down my arm. On the front was my name written in unfamiliar handwriting, neat and sharp. I opened it right away, my heart beating faster when I saw the slip of paper inside. The line was short, like a warning whispered close to my ear. "Emily is not acting alone. Be careful." The anonymous envelope made me walk out of the bank with a cold feeling at the back of my neck. I held that slip of paper in my hand like holding a piece of coal still smoldering, because it said the storm hadn't truly died. But before I could sink into that uneasiness, Life dragged me forward with procedures, with meetings, with the times I had to sign my own real name to erase the forged signature Emily had stamped onto my fate. The case moved faster than I expected. Jonathan Reeves guided me through long days of files, statements, account comparisons, and phone calls that left me exhausted. Andrew Clark provided everything he had as well. Daniel sat beside me during several interviews, his face hollow, his eyes sunken like a man who had just woken from a long trance and had to stare straight at the wreckage he helped create. On the day of court, Emily still walked in with her chin lifted as if she believed she could turn guilt into a misunderstanding. But the evidence was no longer a story she could perform. The secret transfers, the loan files, the forged signatures, the photograph, Andrew's testimony, all of it stacked into a wall that was too solid. When the prosecutor listed the charges, I listened to each word drop. Federal fraud, document forgery, theft of assets, credit fraud, and I saw people in the back of the courtroom start whispering as if they were finally watching a predator get skinned in front of them. The judge sentenced her 10 years in federal prison. In that instant, the whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath, then break into a small wave of satisfaction. Emily snapped her head around, eyes blazing, her mouth curling into a poisonous smile, like she wanted to carve herself into my fear. But she was led away, and the sound of the door closing cut off her last stage. After that, the hardest part wasn't winning in court, it was pulling Daniel back. He started psychological therapy, reluctant at first, then slowly willing to look into the weakest places in himself, his fear of loneliness, his dependence, his craving to be chosen by someone like Emily. There were nights he called me, voice tight, admitting he had made himself pray just to feel loved. One afternoon, Daniel sat on my front steps, both hands covering his face. Then he looked up and said the sentence that made my chest sink. "You're the reason I haven't lost everything, Mom." I didn't answer right away. I only put my hand on his shoulder, feeling his bones steadier than before, like he was learning how to stand on his own feet for the first time in a long time. And I, too, stepped into another chapter. I put back what had been shaken loose, closed disputes, rebuilt my trust with the world. Jonathan came by sometimes, quiet, without drama, simply like a man keeping a promise. One day, when things felt less unstable, he looked at me and smiled. "You don't have to walk forward alone anymore." I stood in my kitchen, the smell of pecan cake spreading again, this time not to beg for a place in anyone's heart, but to remind myself I still knew how to create warmth. I had lost a lot, money, peace, even a piece of my trust in my own son, but in the end, I found myself again.